Hello, everyone.
大家好，
Hi.
大家好。
Welcome.
Hello， 郑老师。
Welcome, everyone. Great to see you here for one more webinar. Please let us know where you are at in this moment. We are so honored to have you in this outstanding webinar. Indiana,
哇 ，Kansas， 哎，陈老师来了。
New York, California, so nice. Friends from everywhere, Michigan as well.
Michigan，
Indiana,
Indiana.
Florida, North Carolina. Yeah, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Seattle. So nice to have many people from our state and also our colleagues, world language colleagues from different states, Massachusetts, Kentucky, our neighbors. So nice to have our neighbors from Kentucky. So we are just welcoming our colleagues. So let's give us 1-2 more minutes. We have more and more people joining in this moment. So nice to have you here. Catherine from South Bend, from our state, Indiana. We also have our colleague from California, Louisiana. Great. So nice, New York, Florida. So nice. So let's see, 1 more minute. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Great to see, read familiar names today. 1 more from Kentucky, Alabama. Great. From overseas, Australia. Our overseas colleagues, we have colleagues from Europe, colleagues from Australia, from Canada, from Delaware, and also from our neighbor Ohio. Hi, everyone. So I believe this is the time to start our webinar. Just to let you know that we will be recording this webinar for people who weren't able to join us. And we have this opportunity for other colleagues in a different time to watch the webinar in the EFOTA channel, YouTube channel, and also the Indiana Language Roadmap channel. Let me introduce myself. My name is Israel Fernando Herrera. I'm a teaching professor from Indiana University, Bloomington, but I'm also the chair for the professional development and the advancement of teaching and learning world languages committee in the Indiana Foreign Language Teacher Association. I have the honor to introduce our directors, people in charge of this program as well, the summer webinars. We have the director of the Indiana Language Roadmap with some details about the webinar, Dr. Eli Conwells. Thank you for supporting these webinars.
Hi, thanks to everyone for joining us today. So happy to see such a robust crowd with us. One piece of information for you is that we will be, anyone who indicated in their registration and attends a majority of the webinar today will receive a certificate for the professional growth points. Please give us a few weeks to get those to everyone. They do take some time for us to produce and send, but those after a few weeks, we'll be sending those professional growth point certificates to people who indicated that they would like one and attended a majority of the webinar today. So thanks so much for attending. And I will also mention for our colleagues who are joining us from Indiana today, the Indiana Language Roadmap has announced our community grants program, and they are for small grants up to $1,000 to host language learning or global competency events. And I'll share that link in the chat for everyone here. And so if you're from Indiana and you have an idea for a small program for your school or community organization, please take a look at that. I will say the one thing I did notice is if you have questions about it, it indicates to email the roadmap, but please actually email us at global@iu.edu, and I'll share that email in the chat as well. So thanks again for everyone for joining us, and I'm so glad you're all here.
Thank you, Dr. Lai Conway from the Indiana Language Roadmap. And also I have the honor to introduce our FLTAD, Indiana Foreign Language Teacher Association President, Chan Mei Wan, who is also going to talk about the fall conference and also introducing our special guest today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Chen Mei Guan. I'm the current Chinese teacher at the Logansport High School, Indiana. It's our great honor to have Matt Koss, Gao Zhengyuan 老师 to be our presenter today. Thank you, Eli, and thank you, Israel, for organizing this fabulous webinar. So before I start to introduce Matt, I will make a promotion about our Indiana Foreign Language Teacher Association. We are going to have a fall conference from November 3rd to November 5th in Indianapolis. And then we still accept the proposal. The due date will be by September 1st. So you're still welcome to submit your proposal and welcome to register for our conference. Gao 老师 Matt Koss is a lecturer in Chinese at the George Washington University and a PhD student in the Second Language Studies program at Michigan State University. And he is trilingual. He can speak English and can teach Chinese and Spanish. Let's welcome Matt.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. It's really cool to be here. I'm pretty new to the Midwest still. I've only been living in Michigan for a year, exactly a year, actually. It'll be a year next week. So it's exciting to connect with people who are here in this sort of region of the States and beyond. Apparently, we have people here from Canada and Europe and Australia. So it's really cool. It's really exciting to be here. Yeah, I guess a little bit more about me that might be of interest. I have taught both Spanish and Chinese to people as small as 3 years old and as old as retirees. I've taught in medical school. I have also taught, university, high school, middle school. So sort of done a little bit of everything, dabbled all over the place. So what I'm going to talk about today, hopefully will be relevant to you sort of no matter what your context is and who you're teaching. But before we get there, a couple things that will be perhaps of interest. Like was already mentioned, this will be recorded. So if you miss it or your internet stops working or you want to come back and watch it again later, it will be there. And I will also share the PowerPoint with Guan 老师 and with the Charades, so you will have access to the PowerPoint later. Since we get asked that a lot, feel free to take pictures, like take screenshots. If you find something that you want right now, you can't live without it for a few days, that's fine. And I'm very comfortable with people sort of using the chat throughout the presentation. So if you have questions that you want to ask kind of while we're in the middle of things here, that is 100% welcome and fine. Let's see. The other thing that's important, I'm noticing the different languages that we might have represented here in the audience. And like I said, I've sort of dabbled and moved around a couple different contexts. Most of my time the last few years has been at the university level, but it's important to keep your context in mind, right? So who you are, what you think about language teaching, who your students are, what age they are, where they're learning the language, what their proficiency level is, whether they're heritage language learners or not, whether they're native speakers, like we talk about, many people teach Spanish for native speakers, for example. Where do you teach? What's the building you teach in, and who are the people in charge, and what do they expect of you? What do your colleagues think? Because having a cohesive program, right, is about collaboration between people. And it's also important that you remember my context, right? I'm speaking today particularly from the recent background of somebody who teaches Chinese to college students. College students, particularly those that learn Chinese in college, tend to be pretty motivated. They're not doing it because they have to, they're doing it because they want to. I teach the entire proficiency spectrum from novice to very advanced. And I teach both second language learners and also heritage learners. So it's important that you think about what we're going to talk about today through the lens of who you are and what you want and what you need. And don't just take everything that I say and think I'm telling you to do exactly as I do in the context where you work. Because if I had all of the answers, I would be very rich and I probably wouldn't be here. I would be on an island or a boat somewhere. So I don't have all the answers. That's that. So to sort of start us off here, my impetus for thinking about this topic really comes down to our goals, right? As language teachers, we have goals. Our students have goals too. And I think of all the different things we might say about what our goals are and what we want for our students and what we think our students want for themselves, whether they're language oriented, they're content oriented, or they're sort of interculturally oriented, one of the words that always stuck out to me is independence. In other words, we want our language learners to be able to use what they learn with us, because of us, without us, right? We want them to be able to go off into the world by themselves and use these skills that we're helping them to develop. Because if they can only do it when we're around, we're not going to be around forever, right? We can't follow them around. I tell my students, I'm not going to be your interpreter out in the world forever. And what students need to reach this sort of milestone, this goal, this independence, is a lot, right? They need a lot of things from us. The whole point, you can learn without a teacher, but if you're going to be learning with a teacher, what is it that a teacher gives you that you can't have on your own? And I think, and we'll come back to that towards the end, but I think some of those things are support, right? Meaningful opportunities, and more importantly, perhaps, is intentional design. So you as the teacher, you as the expert are thinking about, what am I going to do today? How am I going to do it? What order am I going to put things in? When I observe how students are learning or maybe not learning, what do I do to adjust to help them stay on track to meet their goals, right? That's kind of the big idea that's driving this presentation today. So by the end of our relatively short amount of time together here, what I'm hoping that we'll do are three things. One is, this might be new for you, this might be review for you, but that we're gonna look through this model from education called the gradual release of responsibility. And we're gonna make sure that we know sort of the basics of this model. The second thing we're going to do, which is the sort of the meat of the presentation, is we're going to look at different ways we can increase and decrease support so that we're moving students towards independence intentionally, right? So we're thinking about, where are they now? What am I going to adjust so that they can become more and more independent? And then, of course, we wouldn't be sharing if we weren't sharing resources. So I'll share some different resources, including the video recording and the PowerPoint with you towards the end here. That's our goal. That's our tall order for the next 40 or so minutes. So just to get started with maybe some background knowledge, you don't need to reply in the chat necessarily, but something for you to pause. I'm going to pause for 30 seconds and ask you to think, to see if you have any familiarity with this idea of this thing called the gradual release of responsibility. Is that a new word for you? Or is that something that you've heard in your building, at conferences, et cetera, before? So what I want you to think about is, what is this? What is this thing? If somebody asked you, hey, what is the gradual release of responsibility? What might you tell them? And then after that big idea, take another couple seconds to think about, what are the steps? If it's a gradual release, that implies, right, that it's a process. What are the steps in this model? So I'm going to pause here for 30 seconds. Again, you don't have to share in the chat if you don't want to. You can share privately with just me in the chat if you want to, but 30 seconds just to think. Great. I love that it will be new for some people. You can feel free to tell us in the chat if this is new to you or if this is a review, new or review. Give everybody another 10 seconds to activate some background knowledge here, if you have any. If not, no stress. Good, okay, that's okay. No idea what it is, that's what I'm here for, right? Excellent. I love that. I like that framing. This is a goal for me, right? It's new, but that means I'm going to learn it. I like the determination. That's great. Okay, so the gradual release of responsibility, it's drawn different ways. It comes from actually English language teaching, not as a first language, but language arts. But it's been adapted into world language teaching. It's been adapted across all areas of education. And I think it makes a lot of sense. It sort of looks like this. It's often drawn with these two triangles, right? This triangle starts big and gets smaller. This triangle starts small and gets bigger. The gradual release of responsibility perhaps is a nifty name, GRR, right? Maybe it's easy to remember. I prefer to think of it as a transition towards independence. I think that's easier than remembering sort of what does it mean to let go of responsibilities? I mean, I'm being an irresponsible teacher? I don't think so. And this model is made up, sometimes some people call it 3. I prefer the 4-phase or the 4-step version. So it starts with what you might call focused instruction, or what's much easier to remember is called I do, I being the teacher. Then we get to guided instruction, which is often called we do, we being the teacher and the other people in the room. Then you get to what some people might call collaborative learning, which is you do. And again, some people cut it off there, right? It's I, we, you, and that's it. But I prefer the version that separates you do together, meaning you students with less support from the teacher. And then finally, you do alone, right? The idea there is independent demonstration of new learning. So it's this 4-step model. And again, there's lots of details that go into this. I'll show you some of those details in a minute. But the basic idea is that anytime we structure learning, what we want at the end is independence. So to get from I'm not able to do something at all to I can do this confidently and independently, we have a transition process, right? We have this gradual transition of ability, as opposed to we start and then we just say, okay, do it by yourself. I taught you. Don't you know how to do it, right? And then we get mad at students when they can't do it. I taught you this, or you should have learned this in level 1, right? I mean, sure, we can feel those things, but it doesn't actually help with the learning, right? What's cool is a team that I used to work for at the National Foreign Language Center. We took this model and we sort of adjusted it for our understanding of what it looks like for world languages specifically. And to my knowledge, this is the only version of this that exists in this level of detail for world language. So again, I'll share the PowerPoint with you so you don't have to go find this. And we're not going to read all the details here, but you'll see these sort of these 4 levels. And again, you see the teachers sort of role getting smaller and the students' independence getting bigger across the model in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. And that's the big idea, right? The big idea is this transition slowly towards independence. So we're going to come back to this over and over again. But instead of having you try to memorize this entire thing today, what I really want you to remember, if you remember nothing else about the GRR, the idea really is all that you're doing is gradually reducing the amount of support that you give students. So at the beginning, you might be fully supporting them. You might be giving them 100% or 95% support. You're giving them all these resources, all these tools. You're helping them understand language. You're helping them produce language. But the idea is slowly but surely over time, you're going to reduce that 95% to 75 to 50 to 25 to 10 to 5, and maybe eventually to 0, although I'm not sure philosophically in the world if we ever have 0 support, right, in real life. But 5% support, minimal support is surely possible. So that's the big idea, right? The idea is we're gradually reducing the support we give students so that they become responsible for demonstrating their own abilities independently of support. Because if we don't do this, we never know if our students have learned anything, right? If they can do things alone, or if they can only do things because we're giving them support. Can they introduce themselves without the help of sentence starters? Can they talk about their family without a vocabulary list sitting right there that they can look at? The idea is when they're using language outside of the classroom, they're not going to have sentence starters and vocabulary lists. So are we eventually getting them towards that point of independence? That's kind of the big question. So what I do, what I have done and what I was taught by some mentors that really helped me is when I'm lesson planning, when I'm preparing, thinking about the activities that I'm going to do in class, one of the things I really try to ask myself for every single activity from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to however many is I think about how much support am I giving them in each task that we're going to be doing. And then I ask myself, if they're doing it, if they're not doing really well, if they need extra help, what can I do to adjust the support up? And if they're doing well, they don't really need the support, what can I do to take it away? right? Again, slowly, not immediately. So I'm planning for these different possibilities, right? I'm saying if they're performing better than I thought they would, what do I do about that? And if they're not performing where I hope they would be, how can I help them instead of just saying, well, oh, well, you can't do it, F0, right? Move on. No, because we're not in the business of leaving people behind, right? So to give you an example from one of my classes this is an activity I do every year with, second semester novice learners of Chinese, but it doesn't have to be Chinese. This could be any language. What you see here are cards, right? And each card has a prompt on it. The prompt is here in black. So it's a partnered activity. They draw a card and they are supposed to request some kind of information from a peer. So they're trying to find out, where does the person live on campus, where they're from, where their parents live, where their siblings live, whether their parents do these specific jobs, again, recycling previously learned language. And you also see in blue, there's some bonus questions, and we'll get to that in a second. But the idea is here that this task that I'm asking them to do, this interpersonal task, has some support just by the way that I designed it, right? There's a prompt, so they know which words they're supposed to ask. It's not find out any information you possibly can, right? So the idea is, if I give this to students and I realize, they're struggling, they're not able to have this conversation independently with this amount of support, what could I do? Well, I could give them the questions. I could say, use this question to ask for this information, right? I could give them the beginning of a sentence to respond to a question. I can add key vocabulary to each slide. Don't forget that the word for teacher is blank. Don't forget that the word year in school, like grade level, is blank, etc. Right? I can add those things. Or if I'm listening to students, I'm walking around the classroom as they're having conversations and I realize, it doesn't seem like anybody knows this one word, I can write it on the board and be like, hey, if anybody needs this, right, look here. And I can do that again at the group level in the design of the activity. I can do it at the group level after the activity started, or I can just walk around and help individual people as they demonstrate that need, right? That's the big idea. Or I can have students ask a peer, right? They say, hey, I don't know how to say this. I can remind them, you have the language to say, hey, how do you say blah, blah, blah in target language, right? Or other things, right? These are just some ideas. And we could also decrease the support. If this is too easy, if they can have an entire conversation and they don't need any help, I can take away the cards and I can just give my students the task of, I'm going to put you with somebody you don't know. Your job is to find out as much information as you can about them in Chinese, in Spanish, in French, in German, whatever, right? And that, as compared to this, is quite a different challenge, right? There's much more that they have to rely on their own ability to think of questions, think of language, right? Keep the conversation going, etc., instead of having this sort of help, right? The other cool thing that I like about the way we designed this task is it comes with differentiation, so they can always ask additional questions. And even though these are novice learners, I tell my students all the time, right? Hi, what's your name? Matt. Bye. That's not a conversation. Even at the novice level, we talk about novice level students can't maintain conversations for a long time, but we don't do one and done question and answers, right? We try to avoid that as early as possible. So we're already pushing them towards this idea of keep the conversation going as long as you can. Don't just say hi, something, bye, right? So that's the idea, right? That's what I'm hoping to illustrate here with everybody for the next half an hour or so. And actually for years as a teacher, what I used to do in my lesson plans, physically on paper, what I did for a long time was, I kept this sort of mental note of, we have these 4 phases, right? I do, we do, you do together, you do alone. And I had almost these codes. And what I would do is, once I had drafted my lesson plan, starting with my objective, how I was going to see if they met that objective at the end of the day, and then listing out the activities I was going to do, I would actually code them. I would be like, okay, this first activity is a we do activity. Second one is also a we do. The third one looks like a you do together based on what I'm doing and what the students are doing, right? Based on that model I said I'd share with you. The next one also looks like a you do together activity. And then the last one, where I'm supposed to be assessing whether my students can do this thing independently or not, is also a you do together activity. And then I go, uh-oh, that's not ideal, right? What can I do to adjust? When I realize it looks like I'm not giving them enough support at the beginning, and I'm probably giving them too much support at the end if I want to assess independent ability by the end of the class period, even if it's a very small objective, then I go, how do I how do I increase the support here? And how do I decrease the support here, right? This is a way of me reflecting before the lesson actually takes place, but then also after, when I go, you know, students really struggled on this third activity. Perhaps this should have been a quote unquote we do, and I should have increased the support. Or you know what, by here, they didn't need me anymore. I should have decreased the support here. And I know that for next time, right? Or for second block, for third block, whatever. So again, it's the idea of this model, right? This teacher is doing certain things to provide input. Students are doing certain things to process that input. Then as they're gradually moving towards output, I'm doing certain things and then taking away support. As they don't need support anymore, they're doing things more confidently and more independently. That's sort of the big idea there. So sort of the questions that you're asking yourself as the activity designer, as the lesson planner, as the reflector on your own lessons, the big question is, am I gradually building my students' independence, right? Am I doing it slowly but surely? Or am I pushing them into the deep end too soon? Am I saying, you don't get any floaties, you don't get a pool noodle, I hope you don't drown in the pool, right? And just push them in and say, good luck, you figure it out, right? Because the whole point of having a teacher is that you have an expert in the room, so you don't have to try to survive by yourself in the pool, right? Doing that, learning, especially learning something like a language on your own, can be pretty hard, can be pretty scary, can be like swimming in the deep end of a pool. The whole point of us being there as the teacher is we can build these experiences so that they don't have to feel that level of sort of fear and being overwhelmed. So we do it gradually. So we're asking ourselves questions like these, I think. One is we're asking, have they, our students, had enough opportunities to process new language in multiple meaningful contexts across modalities, right? Are they reading it? Are they hearing it? Are they hearing it with captioned video, etc.? Before we start to ask them to produce language, right? Have we given them enough input before we're expecting output? Because we know one comes before the other one, right? We're thinking about, have they, the students, had enough opportunities to produce language in meaningful contexts with support, right? Which balancing new language and language they already knew, before we start to ask them to produce language independently, spontaneously, with no support, right? We're thinking not only about input to output, but support to less support or no support. And then we're asking ourselves, have I, the teacher, reduced the support as students start to demonstrate this independence, until all, or as many as possible, students are producing language spontaneously and accurately, but notice the star, right? Accurately is based on their proficiency level, right? We expect different things from novice, from intermediate, from advanced. And we're basing that on our goals, right? What our lesson goal is, what the performance level target of the course, the unit, etc. is. And then when students can't do what we think they might be able to do based on our teaching, right? Because again, teaching and learning are separate processes. Learning happens, teaching happens. Ideally, learning happens because of teaching, but not always. So when they're not doing what we thought was going to happen, what do we do? Do we have sort of strategies there to add more support when they need it? These are sort of the questions we're asking, and or at least I think we could be asking and reflecting on as we design lessons, we deliver lessons, and then we come back to them later and think about it. So we've been here for quite a bit of time. I see some new people have joined us over the course of the last 15 or so minutes that I've been here talking. Nice to see lots of familiar faces from different states. I'm going to give you a 30-second stretch break, right? Because 45 minutes, 50 minutes, an hour is a long time to sit in front of your computer and listen to anything. So what I invite you to do, it's your house, you do what you want, but what I invite you to do is for the entire length of this 30-second timer, be like this cat. Turn your camera off. I'm going to do that too. Leave your chair, stretch a little bit, and we'll come back in 30 seconds, starting now. Okay, hopefully you had a nice little stretch break. I know I did. We'll keep moving right along here. So what I want to do next is hopefully illustrate in 10 minutes or so an example of an activity progression where we're thinking about increasing and decreasing support, right? So what I'm hoping to give you here is an example that takes this sort of abstract idea that I keep talking about, support and scaffolding, and add more, take it away, right? What does that mean? What does it look like? So giving you an example with an actual lesson objective from somebody's lesson. If we have this goal of I can describe the sports or activities, whatever, that I like and dislike using complete sentences, right? And whether or not you include this in your objectives is worth a conversation. We won't have that conversation today, but taking this objective from a colleague, I can describe activities, we'll say I like and dislike using complete sentences, right? We're targeting about a novice high level of performance. The mode of communication we're thinking about for this objective is presentational speaking, right? So prepared one-way speaking rather than interactional speaking. That's what we're gonna check by the end of the lesson. And how long would this progression of activities take you? I don't know. If you teach for 30 minutes, it might take you a couple days. If you teach for 90 minutes, it might not be enough for 90 minutes, right? Our contexts are different, like I asked you to remember at the beginning. So here's an example of a set of 6 activities. And this is from a lesson that a colleague did that we're sharing here with permission. So if you start your input to output, right, you start with input, maybe doing a game like Simon says. You might have more input with an activity like holding things up, right? They have different things to manipulate. You or some input gives them language and they react to it. They respond to it, showing you that comprehension is taking place. You might then have some charades or something like that. Then perhaps you have an activity called this or that, right? Where you force people to choose. They have to choose option A or option B, can't be in the middle. Maybe have a conversation about it, depends on the level of the learner, right? Then you might have them do something like find someone who, right? That's an activity I think many of us are familiar with, where you go around the room and you look for people who fit a certain criteria. And then you might end with this presentational speaking supported by some visuals maybe of a person introducing themselves and saying, my name is Matt, I really like cooking, I really like drinking tea, I really don't like sports of any kind, right? That might be the end of the product for novice high. That would be pretty cool. So this is, right, this is our 6 activities. We'll go through most of them, if not all of them. And I'll show you what I mean with this idea of sort of adjusting the support up or down, and also looking at what support is built into the task itself. So if we think of this, Simon says, as perhaps on the I do side of the GRR, right? The teacher or someone else, some expert user of the language, could be providing the input, and the students are demonstrating comprehension, right? They're processing language, they're doing something. They're not just sitting there and you're trusting that their brains are focused on you enough to be processing language, right? They're doing something to demonstrate comprehension externally. Inherent to the task, right? If the students' eyes are open and their peers are doing stuff too, that's support, right? Because if I don't understand, I can watch what Israel is doing and be like, oh, I'm supposed to jump right now? Oh, okay, jump. He jumped, I'm gonna jump too, right? And you can also direct feedback at the whole group. You don't have to say, Israel did it wrong. You can say, hey, everybody, remember, this is how you do that thing that I just said, right? So there's kind of less anxiety. It's a little bit more of a supported environment. But if you find that there's struggling happening, right? Comprehension is not taking place like you might want it to, you might add a modality, right? So you might give the students the visual word. You might put the word on, I don't know, a slide or the board or something, or on a piece of paper, and you're saying the word at the same time, right? That multimodal input helps people, especially in languages like Spanish, French, where you have cognates with English, right? Where they're potentially able to process language a bit better. You might give repetition. You might model occasionally with your body language. You might have students come to the front of the room and be sort of your models for the peers, right? That's how you increase support, make it easier for people to do. You could also take support away, right? You could do things, you have to be careful doing things like this because Simon says people are liable to swing their arms around the room, but you can have them close their eyes, right? You can increase the complexity of what you say. Instead of saying short phrases or even words, which I don't love, but you could make complex sentences. So you could say, you could have negation. You can say, Simon is doing this, not that. And if all they're doing is word level comprehension, they might do the wrong thing, right? So you can manipulate the syntax. You can do it faster, right? You can manipulate the speed that you're speaking at. You can increase the number of items in one sentence, right? You can have them jump while they pat their stomach. I don't know, play basketball while they spin around, right? You can do different things. You can even, of course, differentiate by student and have more advanced students be the ones who are giving the Simon Says, as opposed to you. And maybe you give them prompt cards because maybe they can't think of it off the top of their head, right? Again, adjusting the support for the different people at the different places that they are. That's one, right? You might start there. The next thing you might do, like this colleague did, is you might do something like holdups, right? You might give them paper, you might give them actual objects to hold up as they're demonstrating their comprehension, right? So the idea is you're taking away a little bit of the support, you're moving them towards a little bit more independent. They're not able to look around the room and cheat off of their friends necessarily, right? Especially if you design this well. But the students are still demonstrating comprehension, right? They're processing new language. You're not necessarily asking them to say anything at this point. They're reacting to your feedback, right? They're adjusting their understanding of the word, the language you produce, and the meaning that it corresponds to. Built into the task, right, it's probably a limited vocabulary set. You're not using all of the language in the world, right? It's based on what's on the pictures on the paper or what the objects are in front of them. You can let students peek, right? They can look around the room, or you can intentionally build it in so that they check with a partner before they show you their answers, right? You can build in these kinds of little supports. If you want to give them more support, again, you can go multimodal. You can give them something to read while they hear it out loud. You can have them work in pairs as opposed to working as an individual. And if you find that, they really don't need much support, that's also fine. You can take things, you can take the support away. For example, you can take the support away of them seeing their peers by having them hold the card up in front of their chest. What that allows you to do, depending on how your room is set up, right, is if they hold it out up here, people can see it. But if they hold it here, only you can see it, right? If their back is to their peers. You can use words instead of visuals, right? Or you can do two-sided cards. So students have to process your input and the written word and meaning. You can increase the number of cards. So you can have cards that mean like and dislike and love and hate. And then you can have image cards or word cards. So they have to pair the things together, right? Again, you can increase the length of your sentences. You can have them hold up lots of things. You can include complex sentences, right? You can say but, you can say no, you can talk about different people and have them match the cards that way, right? You can manipulate this so that the content is relatively similar, but you're making it a little bit more challenging, right? Next up is charades. Again, I tried to pick activities that I think people are mostly familiar with, but if you're not, feel free to let me know. You can have students, student A acts things out, student B guesses which sentence they're acting out on a piece of paper, for example. And then here, because they're working together, you don't have to be the producer of the language. You can be the monitor. You're walking around being I love what Greta always says, you can be the guide on the side, right? Again, you have some built-in stuff. There's limited vocabulary. You have a partner to rely on so they can request clarification if they don't understand. They're not left there swimming in the water by themselves. You can increase support instead of having students just make up, student A acts it out, student B says out loud, you are playing basketball. You can give them sentences so it's a limited set of possibilities, right? You can give them a phrase sheet. So if they're doing things like requesting clarification, they don't know how to do that, you can give them that support, right? Or you can take it away. You can make it more challenging, right? You can introduce an element like time. So you can see how many can you get right in 30 seconds. Again, I recommend even with college students, because some people are sensitive to things like competition. You're a teacher long enough, you think about these things, right? You can have them compete with themselves, right? They do multiple rounds where they try to beat their own score rather than try to beat other people, because not everybody thrives in a competition kind of environment. But again, the idea here, these are just examples. This is certainly not all of the possibilities, and certainly maybe not even the perfect possibilities. But the idea here that I'm hoping to communicate is that we think about these things, right? As we design the different activities and tasks we're going to have students do, we're always conscious of, if they need more support, where could I give it? How could I give it? Does it require preparation on my part? Or can I sort of get by with my whiteboard marker and a whiteboard or a smart board? Is this something I can type up really quickly while the activity is happening and display? Or is this something I need to have printed out and cut and ready for students in advance, right? Because what that demands of us in terms of preparation is going to be different. But the GRR is lesson design, sure, but it also really is a way of thinking, I think, that I have found in these years of teaching to be quite helpful in supporting students, because one of the worst assumptions I think that textbooks, curricula, pacing guides, all of these things that we inevitably deal with as educators, they sort of assume or lead us to assume, even if that wasn't their intention, that everybody develops at the same speed, right? At the same exact time. I taught it, so they learned it. I taught it, so everybody learned it exactly the same way, exactly in the same second. But all 133 of us sitting here who have been teachers for long enough, we know that that's not true. So it's important that we're thinking about these adjustments that we can make sort of across the spectrum of the activities we're going to do, all the way from input to independent production. Like I said, since I'm going to share the slides, I'm going to skip through these last 3 activities. Again, feel free to look at them later. And if you think they're terrible, feel free to send me an email and tell me that. But the idea is for every single activity you're doing to move students from input, new language, to output that is ideally as independent as possible. Again, maybe not 0% support, but 5 or 10% rather than 90%, is that you're thinking about where can you add and where can you take away support at the group level and at the individual level. And it takes practice, right? I think it does take practice. Practice makes not perfect, but practice makes proficient. So I want to spend the last few minutes we have here, about 12 minutes, it looks like I have, taking a little bit of a deeper look. So that's the big idea of the GRR, is this sort of gradual decrease of support as you gradually get people to move towards independence. But there are a couple of places I think that I've come to understand and had conversations with mentors and colleagues and friends, that the GRR kind of appears or is relevant in our teaching and our design of learning that perhaps we don't think about at the very beginning, right? We think about this and think, oh, that has to do with activities, right? This is a within activity, within class period kind of a framework. It helps us design daily lessons. But I think there are a couple other important places that it pops up potentially. One of the biggest misunderstandings that I remember having early in my understanding of the GRR was that it's linear, right? That it has to go in this one direction. And once you've reduced some support, that's it. It's gone forever and you can't add it back. Not true. So you can always add support back, right? You can move between these sort of teacher does what, learner does what, and you realize, uh-oh, they need help. You can go backwards and you can add more support, or you can go forwards and take lots of support away at once if you're sure that they're ready. In other words, you could be doing one activity at each sort of phase or step of the GRR, or you could be doing 5. And it really will depend not only on your plan, but on the people in front of you. And just because you did it one way last year doesn't mean that this group of students, or first block to second block, right, the different sections of the course you teach, doesn't mean that they'll experience it exactly the same way either. So this is a really flexible design, and it's cyclical, right? It doesn't go in a linear fashion necessarily. And then you kind of have cycles within cycles. You can think about your daily class, or if you teach for really long periods of time, like 90 minutes, and you have kind of a couple of different objectives within that 90 minutes, you can think about how you're gradually releasing the support, right? But you're also doing that same thing. Yeah, gradual release of responsibility. Thank you so much for clarifying that again. You're doing it at the unit level too, right? If you think about where a student starts at the beginning of a unit, they need lots of input, they need lots of support, and you wouldn't expect them to get to complete sort of independence with the objectives that you've designed until towards the end of that unit, right? And that same sort of gradual move towards independence at perhaps a new level of performance, or a slightly more mature same level of performance, also happens over the course of a semester, or the course of a year, the course of a class, right? Spanish 3, AP Spanish, whatever it is that you teach. And actually, one of my favorite things to do in the last few years, again, remember your context, remember mine, but one of the things I actually really like to do at the beginning of a new unit, low stakes, but I think it really helps motivate my students in two ways. That's pretty cool, is I actually will start my units with a homework assignment. It tends to be, sometimes we do it in class, with an independent, no support or minimal support task that's really similar or is exactly the same as my unit goal. And what I'm trying to do there is give my students a baseline to say, today, at the beginning of this new unit, you started here. Now we're going to go through this unit for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, a month, whatever. And then we'll compare your ability on this exact same objective today by yourself to what you can do after we move through this cycle every single day of the unit, right? So for example, an example from a health and well-being unit that I teach with my second years often is, I gave them an objective, which is here, right? That they're talking about what they do and don't do when they're stressed out, right? That's one of the objectives of the unit, is the ability to share and give advice to other people based on your experience. When I'm really stressed, I do this. To de-stress, I do this, right? So what we have them do is brainstorm in the target language and also in English. Actually, we give them a second task that's in English. Brainstorm, what words do you remember? What phrases do you remember? What anything do you know that you can activate? What resources do you already have that you bring to this task that you've learned before, right? Remembering that language learning is cumulative. And then we actually have them do the task. We might have them do it in writing. We might have them do it in speaking. We might have both, but they actually do it, right? At the beginning of the unit. And like I said, then we will also give them a moment to brainstorm in English to say, a minute ago you did this task. Was there any language you wish you had? Anything you wish you knew? And the language that sort of I'm hoping the students will take away from a unit is always improved when my students tell me, right, the vocabulary that is sort of personally meaningful to them. It gets better every single time. Sometimes I learn new stuff, right? And then what happens is at the end of the unit, when they take the assessment, I actually have them go back to that task that they did and compare what they remember doing the day of on the assessment to what they have recorded in our learning management system, what they did 3 or 4 weeks ago. And it's really cool to let the students reflect on how they grew, right? On how they themselves sort of started somewhere, went through this teaching and learning process, and actually developed greater ability to do the same task independently. So this is, again, this idea that the GRR is not linear, right? We started the unit with a short you do alone, and then we went through the cycle over and over and over again. So that's one thing. Another thing that is rampant in our educational system, perhaps is an unexamined practice in terms of how effective it is for different kinds of students, different kinds of tasks, different kinds of contexts. But lots of people give homework, right? Sometimes you're in a context that requires that you give homework. Sometimes you choose to give homework. But one of the things that I love that Fisher and Fry write about in this sort of introductory book to this idea of the GRR, which I'll share in a couple minutes, is they actually spend a section of one of the chapters talking about homework and how homework has to fit into this gradual release of responsibility or this gradual transition towards independence also. And they start by saying traditional homework, in other words, homework, the way most people do it, occurs too early in the instructional cycle. In other words, it occurs too early in this I do, we do, you do together, you do alone cycle. This is a long little chunk, but I'm going to read it to you anyway. They say it makes no sense to introduce a topic at 8:20 a.m. That's late. My high school started at 7 o'clock a.m. And then expect students to be able to do it alone, away from support, 10 or 12 hours later. Students who are just learning a new skill are not going to be able to perform the skill very well on their own. If you release the responsibility, or in my words, push them towards independence too early by making it, this ability of independence, the basis for homework, it's likely your students will reveal themselves to be one of 4 types. I see my friend Florencia is here, and she's done some really great webinars about Google Translate, right? We as language teachers, I get teachers ask me every webinar I do, how do I help my students? How do I make them avoid using Google Translate? And I always want to say, but then I remember I don't have time to do an hour-long webinar on gradual release of responsibility, that maybe it's because you're asking too much of them too fast, right? Students sort themselves into these 4 categories. I love these categories. You get the completers, who are the people that do the homework well, but they do it well because they already had the skills, not because of what you taught them, right? They already had resources, either internal to them, they already had high language proficiency, or they have access to external resources, right? Their parent is a speaker of the language, or their friend, their roommate is a speaker of the language, or whatever. And they find a way to do the work, even though they weren't ready on their own independently, maybe. You get the neglectors, right? The people who are like, I can't do this, too hard, not doing it. And they don't turn it in, right? And these sometimes are the people we scare away from language learning because we make them think, I taught it, so you should know it. Why can't you do it? And they go, huh, yeah, you did teach it. I don't know it. Maybe I'm not good at Spanish. And they quit. And is that the goal? I don't think so. You also get the pleasers, right? The people who do the work even though they weren't ready to do it. They struggle. They end up feeling really frustrated. They're not confident in the work product, but they turn it in anyway. But they're miserable about it. And then you get the cheaters, right? And people have this negative opinion of these students who use Google Translate. And I always feel like at least they turned something in, right? At least they didn't ignore the assignment completely. That shows that at some level, they care about something. Do they care about Spanish or do they care about not getting a 0? Hard to say, but they're doing something, which means maybe if we gradually release the support and let them do it with more confidence and skill, maybe they would do it better and they wouldn't jump to Google Translate because they think they need it. I don't know, right? This is me thinking out loud a little bit. But the idea is that if you do homework, if you give people homework, that you build it into your cycle, that it either is an I do, right? So you're giving them input, you might be having them preview vocabulary and do fluency building and retrieval with vocabulary. If you know there's some grammatical structure that they really need and you can give them a simple explanation just enough that they need it, and you want to do that like a flipped classroom kind of design before class, you can do that, right? Or you can have them do a you do alone task, right? An independent task with minimal support that may be output focused. But the idea is that you've been through this entire cycle of the GRR. You're not just saying, oh, go figure it out. I hope you do well, right? So that students feel prepared, and then hopefully they're less likely to fall into the temptation of the online translator, the roommate who's the native speaker of the language, whatever. I'm going to skip these examples. You can look at them on your own. And then, you know, the other thing is you can build into your tasks. I do this a lot, right? I ask my students, when I tell them this task, you can use resources that we've given you in class. I ask them, how much did you rely on resources or no? And they're pretty honest. I mean, my students generally are like, yes, I did. No, I did it by myself. And you can usually tell too, right? But the idea is having them be thinking agentively, thinking actively as making a choice to use a resource or not. And if they have resources and they know they can use them, maybe they won't go to the Google Translate, right? So I want to end here with two things. One, I'm going to talk really briefly about what I think the roles, our roles as teachers are, kind of with the GRR, but bigger as well. And then I want to give you some homework, right? I did a lot of I do here today, gave you a lot of things to process, but now it's your job to continue to process them as I release you into your independence. I think people can learn things without a teacher. I truly fundamentally believe you can learn without a teacher, but you can't teach without a learner. You ever thought about that? Which one of us is the center of this operation and which one of us could be not involved? But I think because we're here as teachers, we can make the process more engaging. Because have you ever tried to learn a language on your own? Boring. You think, oh, Duolingo is so fun. Yeah, it's fun for like a week, right? I think we can make the learning process more efficient because I think I, as a learner, should be able to do more with you as a teacher than I can do by myself in the same amount of time. I think that's the point, right, of this structured learning. I think teaching is more effective than learning by yourself, maybe, hopefully, when it's done well, right? Teaching might include feedback. It might include intentionally structured learning, which is where I focus today. It might include realistic goals. It might include content that I couldn't find by myself. It includes assessments that help me learn better, right? And then I also think we make our jobs fun. If I know anything about Guan Laoshi that's here, I know that she makes learning enjoyable for her students. I see it on social media every day. Because the idea is if I'm not engaged, if I'm not enjoying this long process of language learning, if I'm not seeing myself making progress, and if I think, you know, I speak English, lots of people in the world speak English, I don't need to learn Spanish, whatever, then what am I going to do? I'm going to quit, right? But I think we as a teacher play these critical roles in language learning, in learning at all, And a big part of that is intentionally structuring the learning experience. And the GRR, I think, really helps as a way of thinking, in addition to being a way of sort of lesson planning. Because the idea, right, if you want somebody to learn to ride a bike, you help them slowly. You might support them at the beginning. At some point, you're going to let them go and say, oh, you can do it. And they're probably going to fall down. But when they fall down, you don't say, well, I'm putting the training wheels back on, right? You have to go use a 3-year-old bike, even though you're 7. No, you give them the support that they need. You help them back up. And eventually, they ride the bike, right, by themselves, happily and freely. And they don't need you anymore. But what you definitely don't do is put them on a bike for the very first time. Hopefully you give them a helmet and you put them at the highest hill you can find. And you say, good luck. I hope you make it. See you later, right? That's not the idea that we do here. So hopefully we met our goals here, and I will end with homework. Your homework is as follows. I mean, who am I to give you homework, right? School's about to start. You're busy people. But should you be so inclined, you can do some homework. If today this was brand new for you, you've never heard these 3 letters used together, GRR, that's fine. That's awesome. I'm so glad you came. One of the things you can do is review the resources, right? There's a book on the next slide that I think you'll benefit from. You can look at some of your lesson plans and see if you start to see this progression of lots of support to minimal support, right? And you can do what I do and look for the places where maybe you need to adjust, right? If today you're like, oh yeah, GRR, like I've heard of this before, I more or less know, like I do, we do, you do, yeah, I kind of get it. You might look for opportunities to adjust the scaffolding and support in the lessons you're going to teach the first week of school, right? You might look at the different activities, sort of like we did today, and list, what kind of supports could I give the whole group? What kind of supports could I give individual students? And how can I help them be more independent, right? And then another thing I think is really important to think about is how much support are you giving people on an assessment? I think giving 0 support is perhaps not realistic. It's not like what happens in real life when you use another language, but giving them too much support on an assessment doesn't give you the information that you want. An assessment is just an information gathering tool, right? And if you support them too much, you don't know if they can do the thing by themselves, which is why you were testing them in the first place. And if this was like old news, you're like, Matt, I already know all this. I could have given this workshop instead of you. That's awesome. I look forward to your workshop coming soon. But one thing I would challenge you to think about is your homework. Do you build homework consciously into the daily cycle of this gradual release of responsibility? Or are you just like, oh, we didn't get to this in class, go do your homework? And then do you struggle with things like Google Translate? I don't know. And then you can think bigger picture, right? Not just the single day, but the week, the unit, the course. Is it all sort of building this slow ability towards independence? And then finally, if you're doing cool stuff, if you have the GRR kind of figured out, share with us, go to the IFLTA conference in November and share with us how you're doing this cool stuff. Because the whole point is that we go further together, right, as teachers.
Okay, so yeah, thank you, Florencia, for your comment and sharing as well. There are some comments about that there is a 3rd edition, so thank you, Charlene. So Matt, we know that you have a commitment right after this webinar. So really thank you on behalf of FLTA and all the colleagues here in Indiana and also in the States and overseas. In some parts of the world, it's after midnight, and we really appreciate our
thank you, everyone.
colleagues in other places joining today. So thank you, Matt. I hope to see you here in Indiana for the fall conference in November. And thank you, everyone. We will be keeping you in the loop with more PhD, professional development, and world language teaching and learning opportunities for our world language teachers here in the state of Indiana and also in the United States.